Great. All right. So we'll get started. Just so everyone knows, we are recording this webinar and it's going to be made available in a few different areas, probably our website and our YouTube channel. So don't be too afraid if any of your colleagues are looking for this, or any members of your team, or if you just want to have another run through of it. We're going to be making this webinar and all subsequent webinars available through various channels. Awesome. So without further ado, we'll get started. So a bit of housekeeping first. Like I mentioned earlier, just make sure that you can, first of all, see my screen. You're able to obviously hear me. That's the most important part. But also just make sure you can use the chat. So there will be a chat option either on the top or the bottom menu, depending on the way your screen's set up, in the Zoom panel itself, that you can use to ask a question, a Q&A, and also a poll. We probably won't be using the poll option today, but for the Q&A, we do have one of the teams standing by. Now, I do have an area at the end for questions. However, if you do have any questions, you can pop that into the chat along the way, and we'll be more than happy to answer that. Great, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me today on our first webinar. We're kicking off with creating your first scenario and opening position. So I'll jump straight into it. My name is Sudesh Madali. I'm a partner success manager here. Now, a lot of you may or may not have already chatted to me using the green bubble. So I'm also on there as part of the customer success team. I'm trying to help everybody out. But yeah, it's nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining me today. So why do we have this on today? So the purpose of today's session is it's part 1 of 3 of our scenario tool introduction. So the three areas are going to be today's session, obviously, on introduction to the scenario tool. Tomorrow's is going to be on propositions. That's where we'll really dig into the meat of the scenario and figure out how we create all those different insights that you'll get a glimpse of today. And the final one is getting through the interpretations, obviously, with the future planning tool. The interpretation and the subsequent turning into a plan of that information is the most important part of this whole process. So we'll take an entire session and look at how do we, first of all, digest reports that come with the scenario tool? What can we do with them? And the most important part, how do we turn that or help that influence a future plan or budget in conjunction with our advisor, or if you're an advisor, in conjunction with your farming client. So for the purpose of today, we'll look at very briefly, why is it important for farmers to future-proof their business? With COVID-19, that's becoming a lot more obvious. Then we'll look at a brief introduction into what are scenarios that figured and where do we place that tool in our feature set. And then we'll go into how to create your first scenario, and we'll look at how to first of all, obviously create it. Then more importantly, how to import data from any existing data sets you have in Figured and Zero. And then we'll get into setting up an opening position. So that's the manual adding of your assets and liabilities. And then we'll cap today's session off with a brief of Q&A and some other handy links and some post work that I'll give out to you guys to get you ready for tomorrow's session. And as I mentioned as well with the Q&A, we do have someone standing by on the chat bubble that's within the Zoom chat. So we will have a time at the end. If you have any really broad overarching questions or anything that you feel that might be applicable out to the wider audience, maybe save it towards the end, because then I can answer them out. We can get everyone getting that feedback. However, if it's something specific, or you're more sort of one of our pro scenario users and you have something that you want to ask at that moment in time as we're looking at it, feel free to pop it into the chat, and we've got Jesse on there to help out as well. Great. So the why, it's pretty obvious. Why is it important for farmers to future-proof their business? So, pre-COVID-19, there have been a few different variables for this, but with the advent of COVID-19 and subsequent lockdowns, the impact it's going to have on the economy, it's becoming more important now, right now especially, to be able to figure out where's your business at, where is it going, and what are the various levers that you can push and pull to be able to create different things in your business. And so to kind of cut to the heart of that, the sudden impact of COVID-19 has brought to light the importance of having a strong balance sheet that can withstand against huge market swings. So obviously the changes in the export market that we're seeing now is a different driver of that. At first we had dairy going down with China, but then, again, coming up again as they start to come back online. We also had similar issues with meat exports as well, but then we managed to redirect that to the US and still managed to keep that balance sheet in a good position for sheep and beef on a whole. However, now we're sort of seeing a new set of challenges now that New Zealand's in lockdown and the rest of the world also are in lockdown as well. So changes in export markets mean income streams are highly variable, a lower farm gate forecast for dairy potentially, and new processing protocols, more importantly for sheep and beef, that will affect capacity. So what we're seeing is a real backup of of stores, first in China and cold storage, but then in other parts of the world. So we managed to get that February export out to the US market and kind of help with that downturn in China. But now with the increased processing protocols that have been put in place for meat processing to ensure social distancing and general hygiene and cleanliness has really sort of put a real big impact on the ability for these processing plants to process in a timely manner, which means that we're going to have potentially more stock or more meat in cold storage, or even worse off for farmers, animals staying live on farm, which means a whole lot of added expenses to that. So again, this takes us onto the third point. These factors are driving farmers to increase their acre position, reduce expenses, and drive high efficiency in production. So these points are important at any time of the year, at any time of any business, especially with farming as well. And I know the spotlight has been on farming for quite a while now. So a lot of the industry has already been gearing itself up, which puts us in a very good position. However, if you haven't up until this point, it's really important to do so now. And then if we take COVID-19 out of it for a second, we can't forget that we have been in a drought in New Zealand for the last 6 months, potentially even longer, and that's still prevalent now, especially in Northland and Waikato, which is seeing dam levels critically low at the moment. So we're not out of the woods, even in some homegrown issues. So it's a really, really tough time in all industries, especially farming as well, but even more important to obviously plan for the future. So how do scenarios fit into this, and why do we at Figured sort of place it so highly on our ability to be able to plan efficiently? Well, the short of that is that it's a future planning tool. So you're able to see further down the road with a detailed 2 to 10 year plan. So again, really powerful. It's a huge variance there between 2 to 10 years. A 10-year plan is obviously a really, really long, far down the track plan, whereas 2 years is the complete opposite. So the amount of different scenario models that you can create in the scenario, in the tool, excuse me, is quite vast. Start by building now. So if business continued as usual, where would you be in 5 years? And this becomes your guiding North Star. So, scenarios again, as a future planning tool, it's real easy to get carried away and start planning out these really elaborate potentials, use cases that may never eventuate. Or with COVID-19, you never know what's going to happen these days. But it's really important to build up, where does your business go if nothing changes as of right now? And we probably want to have our right now position be probably sometime last year. Right now is a very, very variable time. We wouldn't want to budget or create any foundations of that. But going back 6 months and saying, all right, just take that as my starting point. And especially now with what's going to happen over the next 8 to 12 to 24 months, using that as your guiding North Star and trying to get back to that point could be really, really powerful in keeping your business on the right track. And then finally, how does your farm stand up against the world? So run specific scenarios to future-proof your business in a changing world. So fairly self-explanatory for this one here in a post-COVID world. We never know what's going to come at us now. So we have to be prepared in every single way to tackle whatever comes through. So, farmers in a strong equity position or a strong cash position are going to find they're going to be able to withstand the economic impacts for a lot longer versus farmers who aren't in that position. So it's a great time to get in touch with your advisors, either talk about strengthening that position or potentially trying to chart a path down to achieve that safety net. So what are some of the core benefits? So if we move away from the economic climate and look at the scenario tool itself, what are some of the core benefits that it offers to enable you to do this future planning? And one of the first and in my opinion, one of the most important ones is the ability to create your source of income and expenses from existing data that sits within Figured and Xero. So as we're aware, Xero is your source of truth. You've got your bank feed set up in Xero. That's the truest source of data that you can get. And then that same data set is flowing into Figured and allowing you to do transaction reconciling for your livestock and get your end of year milk and to do your budgets and planning. So it's a really, really rich source of information, but also a very accurate source of information. So being able to create a future scenario of such a highly detailed, accurate set of data, really puts a scenario tool in a field of its own. So if you've been using Figured up to now, even if you've just been using Xero up to now and you haven't had Figured, or you've had the Figured Lite package that's been recently upgraded, you can still take advantage of this data import, which we'll take a look at a bit later. Enter your assets and liabilities. So The addition of assets and liabilities to complete your financial position, it does exist in quite a few different areas of the platform, as well as Zero and even other products as well. But the ability to bring it into a future position is where this really gets powerful. Again, you're putting in assets and liabilities against a really, really strong source of data, and you're able to create a complete financial position. And at the end of the day, with equity being the saving grace right now, it's really, really important to know what that position is. So we'll take a look at how to get that, and also how to calculate handy stats like your LVR and obviously your equity position too. So model the change you want to make. So changes to your assets and liabilities, purchases of a new herd, taking on a new loan, or even just business as usual. So this is the bottom line value proposition of scenarios, isn't it? It's a future planning tool. It's the ability to push and pull various levers in your farm's financial book to figure out where you're going to go and what could potentially happen should the worst case eventuate. Awesome. So that's a basic little overview of how we got to where we are now, and why scenarios is important. First, as a tool in your current tool set, but also against an ever-changing world. So what we'll look at now briefly is how do we create a scenario, and also how do we add assets and liabilities into that scenario to create our opening position before we end the session in preparation for tomorrow's session on proposition. So we'll jump straight into it. And so a bit of housekeeping first. So for those of you who are newly upgraded from Light to Financial Farmer, so that's anybody who's on the call right now, you will notice a few different things as, now that you log into Figure. So we'll cover those in briefly, as it probably takes a lot longer to get into them into detail. But the first is dashboard. So you'll notice at the top left, you now are welcomed into a dashboard screen, as well as you now have a dashboard option on your menu as well. So that's part of our Financial Farmer package. It just offers you a couple of handy widgets to create some top level information, some good insights there. Planning, so this is the most powerful part. So we're going to elaborate on this in a lot more detail in future webinars on the power of planning and Figured, but that's one of the major components that you get in Financial Farmer. And obviously the reason we're here today is scenarios. So you see those three: dashboard, planning, and scenarios are separated out here. So to access that, get into your menu, click on scenarios, and we land at the scenarios page. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new scenario. So on the top right-hand corner here, we'll see create new scenario. For those of you who don't have any credit, you see a nice big green button that says create new scenario. So I'll click on that. And the first one that we're taken to is create a new scenario. So we'll call this our status quo. So this is a good segue to sort of talk about what a status quo is. So I touched on it a bit earlier. Status quo is your business as usual. If nothing changed for the next 5 years, how would my business look? So this is built off obviously existing data and Figured, but if you built a blank scenario, you could do the same thing. The real power behind a status quo scenario is, A, you first of all know where your business is going if nothing changed right now. Sometimes that's enough of an insight in itself. A lot of business owners aren't quite aware where their business could be in 5 years. They understand 12 or 24 months, 5 or plus years, they're not quite sure. And sometimes the results can be surprising. So it's good to first of all get in there and make sure your business is strong, at least for the next 5 years anyway. Another benefit of this, and which we'll see in later sessions as well, is the ability to copy scenarios and Figured. So you can copy and create as many scenarios as you want. So you're not limited by any amount at all. And so the last thing you want to do is create a scenario, spend all this time going through it, and then you come back in about a couple of weeks' time, and the lockdowns happen, and you want to model some new changes, and you go in and ruin that scenario that you spend all that time creating and having to keep redoing that all the time. So you create the status quo scenario, it's business as usual, and then each time you want to model something different or something new, you just make a copy of that status quo scenario and then create the modeling change in that. So we'll take a look at that in a lot more detail in later sessions, but that's why we create our first scenario status quo, and that's why we also call it status quo. You can use business as usual, any kind of naming convention that just lets you know that this is business as usual for the next 5 years. So start date. So your start date's always going to be the most recent financial year that you have completed in Figured. So you're never going to be able to go back too far, get into future planning tool. We don't want you creating future models on dates that have already passed, because you've got the rest of Figured and all that other rich data that already exists from zero to be able to figure that out. So we'll start with June 2019. The duration, as I mentioned, from 1 actually, through to 10 years. Now that's going to be set as default as 5, and we'll leave that as 5 for now. A little caveat with this here is that when you do copy a scenario, you can never reduce the length of the scenario. You can only increase the length of it. So if you're planning on changing durations in your scenario, I'll probably suggest to make your status quo just 3 years. And that way you have a little more variability in terms of increasing the duration down the track. So the sharing option or privacy option, so this is really powerful, especially for the advisors that are on the line and potentially 1 or 2 bankers as well. So you can have your scenarios private, shared, or with your organization. So obviously my organization is Figured Support. You would see either your bank or you would see your accounting practice as a third option. So creating it as private is private to yourself and nobody else on the farm. So even if someone else has got admin permissions or they're the owner of the farm, or it doesn't matter what they have, they cannot see your scenario. It's completely private. So this is really good if you want to create something in a silo that you don't want to share with anybody else. Whatever the use case may be for that, just choose private. Shared, it's going to be shared with everybody on the farm. So that's when you're creating something that everyone's either going to be viewing or interacting with. Put it on a shared, everyone can have a look. That's invited into the farm. And the last one is organization. That's pretty self-explanatory. You're giving access to the other members of the organization to be able to get in here and have a look as well. So the standard sharing option is shared. So leave it on that unless you need to make it private. Farming operations, again, fairly self-explanatory here. For the purposes of today's, we'll go with a dairy setup. So a dairy and livestock. And as you can see here, the display metrics flipped over to $ per kilogram of milk solids as I chose dairy. Of course, you can switch that back if you want to, but it makes more sense to have it there. Then once you've confirmed all that information, you can go ahead and click next on the bottom right. And this brings us to our next window. So we have 2 options here: import and use my farm data, or start from a blank scenario. I think I've already said quite a bit on the benefits of importing your farm data, so we will go ahead and look at that. However, if you wanted to start from a blank scenario, you can do that. So the things to note there: assets and liabilities are always manually added. Even if you import your data, you're still going to have to add those in piece by piece. So the main parts you're losing out on when you start from a blank scenario is importing any income trackers that you have, and also importing that expense position that you've been building by all the different expense coding that you've been doing. So if you wanted to maybe enter a expense position on a whole or by grouped, we'll look at that in tomorrow's session. You can start from blank scenario. But we're going to import and use my farm data. So the first option we get given is data type. So I click down on that. I'm shown actuals plus forecast. So for those of you who are aware, we still have our 2 different planning methods. We've got rolling plan and we have non-rolling plan. And so that's our new planning method that we're looking to move everybody onto. However, if you're not onto the new rolling plan method by now, you will have an extra option here called budget. And of course, if you want to choose your budget as your model, then you can do so. The next option is year. Now, the important part to note with this here is you're not selecting the year that the scenario is going to start from. We actually did that on the previous screen. What you're selecting here is the year that you want to import data into. So I would like that to, in this particular case, match the same year of the starting, which is 2019. However, I could say, look, 2019 was really crazy. It was a lot of drought, a lot of bank regulations coming into effect. It was all over the place. We're still adjusting. I don't really feel it was a true reflection of what our farm's capable of, but 2017 or 18 may have been that year. So you can say, look, I want to make my status quo off that information and not last year, in which case you can choose that year in here. When you do that, however, just bear in mind that it's going to take data from that year and place it into the first year of the scenario. So sometimes that can be a bit confusing for users where they might expect the scenario to now start from 2017 or 18. It's not going to do that. It's going to take the data from that year and place it into whatever the first year is for your scenario. So leave that as 20. Actually, I'll take 2020. So actuals to April 2020. Then you can choose to import on cash or profit basis. It doesn't really matter too much here as it's an annual tool that's quite far into the future. However, if you are thinking about what it's going to take, it's basically going to be following the payment periods that are set in the account configuration section. So you don't get any confusion there. You can always refer back to account configuration to find out what your transaction and cash dates are. Then the real good stuff here is trackers, income, and expenses. So I've got a dairy cattle tracker and I've got a milk tracker on this farm that's already been set up and collecting data. So obviously I'd want to import those in. Now, when I say I'm importing those in, what is it actually importing? I will, we're able to see that in tomorrow's session, but briefly, for your dairy cattle, it's going to import your entire stock rec for that same year, including any opening positions as well, opening quantities, and same with the milk tracker as well. For other income, if you've got any other income areas, so for those of you who have been using Financial Farmer, you will see that it does bring in all your other income areas to display in your planning grid. All those other income areas will be brought in as well. And then expenses. So all of the expenses that are on farm, either in figured or in zero, will be brought in as well. So one of the really powerful things about scenarios, and now that for those of you on the line who have moved from Light onto the new Financial Farmer in the last couple of days, is all the expense coding you have been doing in zero, and same with the other income coding that you've been doing in zero, you'll be able to use that in your new scenario. So that's all been sitting there the entire time, and you're able to use that in the scenario to create that really detailed expense position. So it's a good benefit there. So make sure these are all ticked. But once you're happy with it, we can go ahead and click import and create. And wait for that to create the scenario. So what I'll do in the meantime actually is we'll hop over to a new one while it creates that and take a look at what we're looking to achieve with an opening position. So as you can see, our assets and our liabilities are really well laid out in quite a lot of detail. So what we'll look to do now is emulate something close to this by adding in these various areas one by one. Perfect timing there. If you do find that sometimes the creation of the scenarios does hang a bit, or it's giving you a few issues, you can just click on the scenario tool option on the left here, and you'll see that status quo option clicked in there, and you can click back in, and sometimes it lets you go straight into the scenario. Sometimes takes you back to that loading screen if it hasn't loaded enough yet. As you can see here, it's taking me straight into the scenario. So I'll hop over to the opening position because that's what we're doing today. And here we go. So quick contrast over to the screen we saw earlier. This is obviously completely empty with the exception of that asset, which I'll explain in a second. So let's go ahead now and enter in our asset and liability position. So once we enter into the screen, we'll see now a breadcrumb trail showing us what we have left to do in the scenario. So propositions tomorrow's session, it's the major meat of it, and the reports and exporting is next week, Tuesday. A handy little guide at the top here. If you have imported information into the scenario, it's going to tell you that on the top left here. So scenario created by myself based on 2020 actuals plus forecast actuals to April 2020. So if you are seeing some really odd stuff in the scenario that you aren't quite sure about, it's always good to have a look to see if data's been imported into that, because 9 times out of 10, it may have imported something that you weren't expecting, and that's where that variances come from. Wait, let's hop straight into the creation of assets. So the first thing we see here is the dairy cattle on hand asset. So obviously your dairy cattle on hand is an asset. So we bring that in from the tracker. As you can see here, the quantity on hand has already been brought in from that tracker, and it's added in the market value per head. Now that market value per head is preloaded as herd scheme. You can change it here, or you can change it in the configure livestock area. But for those of you who are wondering where we get those values from, those are just the most recent year's herd scheme values. So this configure livestock area is something we can use to tweak some of the automatic calculations and also the market value that's applied to each of these stock classes. However, we're going to cover that in tomorrow's session, as you can also access it from proposition as well. We click on add asset. So on the top left here, add asset, and we get taken to the add opening asset screen. So the first thing we want to do obviously is add in our rural property. So let's go land home. Now I've got a few different ways of doing this. So the first thing you want to do is definitely enter in the effective areas, or total area, sorry, which is 119 hectares. Now what I can do here is I can go in and add in value per hectare, if you so happen to know that, or if you'd like to model a scenario based on that, or you may have just been given that valuation per se, or you can go in and enter in a total value. So we'll leave it as that. And there we go. Easy as that, we'll add it in a rural property as our land home. Now let's add in a few more. We go ahead again and click on add asset, and let's go and add in some P&E, so plants and equipment, or we can even say, milking equipment. Transparency, probably quite expensive, but we'll just say an arbitrary number there just to put something in. We click again, let's add in one more asset here. So we want to just actually, I probably should go back a step and say, let's go through some of these so there's no confusion. So at the very top, we've got opening cash position. So opening cash position, if we click on that, we can see here we've got two options, in credit or overdrawn. So it's pretty self-explanatory, in credit or overdrawn, and we can add those in accordingly. You can put in your facility limit, so we can always work out how far away you are from your overdraft limit, as well as an interest rate. And on the utilization side, as it basically says, it's just in a given 12 months, what's the utilization of your credit, in a sense, how many percent are you overdrawn, or how close are you to that limit in a given year? So banks use that quite a lot to say, look, over the previous 12 months, you've spent majority of your time in 80% overdrawn. I'm not sure how well positioned you are to get an extension on your overdraft. Or the inverse of that means you might get some kind of lending terms. We've got Livestock. So Livestock is fairly straightforward. As we saw, we entered one in before. But for those who want to have a look at how it's entered, we choose a name. And we go ahead and choose a stock type. Dairy cattle. It's pretty simple. It just brings up the quantity on hand. Now, obviously, that's a much smaller amount of stock classes. And the reason it's doing that is because I have imported data. So it's taken a reminder of what my applicable stock classes are. So in the main operation tracker, you're able to disable certain stock classes. So if you've taken the choice of disabling certain stock classes and then you've imported in, we save that information. So when you add any new dairy cattle trackers, we're not going to ask you to enter in a whole lot of stock classes that you don't really require. However, when you create a brand new dairy cattle tracker on a blank scenario or a scenario that doesn't have an imported tracker, you'll get a full list of all of our available stock classes to be able to add to. Great, so crops, horticulture, also just trackers as well, and they build off that. We're going to be unpacking that in more detail in some subsequent scenarios and how to get the best out of crops and hort. And we've covered rural property, residential property development, and machinery and equipment are fairly straightforward in a sense that they just take a name and a total value, where shares ask for a little bit extra in the sense of a symbol, which we've got there as Fonterra, but you can put any symbol that you want, and the more important parts of quantity and market value per share. And the final one is other. So other is obviously the catch-all. We've got other opening asset and other liability. So the best time to use this here, and for the advisors on the line, is if you're wanting to capture any other assets that are important to that calculation. I think the one piece of advice that we do give is not to get too detailed with the scenario. Of course, if you've got an AP that is going to be crucial in sort of calculating some important information at the end of that year, of course, add it in. But if you've got $500 amounts or $1,000 or $2,000 amounts in a farm that's got millions going for it, you're probably just going to be adding excess bulk to the scenario that's not really going to benefit you in any way. So it's good before you start any scenario to think, right, what am I really trying to achieve out of this? How detailed does my information have to be to achieve my said goal for this? And that way you're going to save time in entering a scenario, but you're also going to reduce clutter, meaning that the insights are going to be a lot easier to glean. Awesome. So that's enough about assets. So we'll move on to liabilities, and we'll add in a couple liabilities to see how it works. So here as well, liabilities, click on add liability. And here are the different options that we have: overdraft, bank loan, home loan, family loan, HP, and other. So we'll enter in a bank loan here. We'll call it a term loan 0 to 1. So that's our facility limit. But for example, we might say, and here's where it gets really interesting, is the repayment type. So the repayment types are interest only, table, fixed principal, annually, quarterly, and monthly. So, right now, one of the first things out from the bank is have a chat, or first thing out from accountants or anybody is have a chat to your bank, see, does moving to interest only help me save some money in the short term? Or, should I be moving to table now and start making some proper payments? Or I've got some cash aside. Is it time now to really put it towards that principal and secure or strengthen my position moving forward? So having this repayment type in here and the ability and the proposition to restructure that repayment type in future dates, which we'll look at tomorrow, is where the scenario gets really, really powerful. So we'll take some time to look at that tomorrow, but for now we'll go table. at 4.46 over 25 years, and we'll save that. So as you can see, not only is this, quite powerful in a sense of being able to enter this information in, but it's also very quick. And so we've designed this tool with that in mind. Like, we don't want to bog you down entering a whole lot of information. The main aim of this tool is to gain insight and use that insight to further business. And so getting caught down in the detail, unless you really want to, is not really going to be helping anybody. So from the user interface perspective, we really shortened it down, which means that, as you can see, it's taken me a couple of seconds to enter each of those. And without me talking, within about 10 minutes, I would end up in a position like this, which, as you can see here, we've got a land home, building, office equipment. We've got a total current assets, if that's applicable. As you can see here, it's a catch-all for anything that's below a certain amount. We've got furniture, fertilizer company shares, so on and so forth. And there's some dairy company shares in there as well. If we click on that, that's how it looks when it's being filled in. And over on the liability side, we've added in a second term loan here, which captures some of the borrowing for those smaller items. But we can see those both broken down quite nicely. And you can put it on interest only as well. Again, it's completely up to you. And once you're done with that, you get to see what your opening position actually is. So what's your total assets? What's your total liabilities? What's your total equity, that equity percentage, and that loan to value ratio, which up until, a couple of years ago was, mainly a bank term. But since the housing crisis and a few other things that have happened in the economy, it's really important now to know what your loan to value ratio is. And if it's too high, to strengthen it in some ways. And that's another valuable part of the scenario is equity percentage in LVR is something that, we do need to know these days. And most people haven't, especially on the farming side, have not known that. So entering this in on the first page, you're able to get some insights and say, oh, wow, I'm actually a lot better off than I thought I was. Or immediately going, wow, all right, that it was as bad as I thought it was. It's really time to gain some insights here and make some changes. So that's opening position in a nutshell, guys. It's not a lot to enter, like I mentioned, but it is a really, really powerful part of the scenario. So in terms of, let's pop back over here for a second. So in terms of next steps before we go to a Q&A, for whoever's on the call who's joining us tomorrow, I really would like everyone to get into either their own scenario or one they're a part of, or even a brand new one if you haven't touched scenarios before, and go ahead and create your first scenario and create that opening position. I think it'll be a really good exercise to build that foundation before we get into proposition tomorrow. But also it's just good to get it in and know where it's at, and it'll just add more context to tomorrow's session and just mean you'll get more value out of it as well. But more importantly, if you do encounter any issues, our session is not till 1:30 tomorrow, so you can reach out to our team and fix that stuff and really be poised and ready to follow along with me in tomorrow's session and get the best value out of it. So get in there, get your scenarios created. Like I said, a majority of your customer base for the advisors on the line are going to now be on Financial Farmer and have access to scenarios. So yeah, really look forward to have everybody prepped and ready for tomorrow's session on proposition. We'll go to some Q&A now, and I just wanted to just talk about what's currently sitting on the screen. So we've got a couple of handy links. So we've got live chat if you're looking for some support. So use the green in-app bubble to reach out to a customer success team. So that green app bubble is down the bottom right here. So that's available at any page on the application, or if you're on our website, www.figure.com, that's available on there as well. So this is where you're able to interact with our team. You click on new conversation. That's going to bring up a conversation. Hi, I need help completing my opening position. We do have a bot that might forward you some really handy links should your question be really straightforward. However, if it's not, one of our team will be in touch really shortly, or within 10 to 5 minutes, and be able to help you out. If you're a brand new customer, you'll get this little prompt to follow through. We'll collect some information on you, so do fill that out. It just helps us help you the next time. Otherwise, if you've been in touch with us before, that's always the best way. Video tutorials. So our YouTube channel has great content ranging from previous webinars through to detailed tutorials on specific areas of the application. This is one of my favorite areas to help both myself and even clients as well really get up to speed. It's got a lot of detail and a lot of videos. So if you've got the time, or if you've got the motivation to really get into it, do that. It's the best place to learn. And with moving screens as well, it just makes the learning a lot better. And the last area is some good reads. So we have been working with farmers to try and prove out the benefits of planning for the future for a while now. And we've got some teams that have come on board with us and have really seen some success from that. So there's a great case study on how planning for the future helps stabilize and accelerate this farm's growth. So jump on to www.figure.com, take a look at our blog under the post Planning for Your Future. It's a really good read on a Dunedin-based farm called Overhill. Awesome. So I think it's enough talking from me for the moment. I'll break now for some Q&A. You can either just yell that out, or you can reach out in the chat and I'll just post it out to everybody. If anybody doesn't have any questions or they feel quite satisfied, please make sure that you are registered for tomorrow's webinar. You should have received an email and in-app message with some links to that. If not, you can jump on our website and there's a registration link on there. Yeah, if you're quite happy, then you're more than welcome to jump off, and I'll hang on here for another 5 minutes to answer any questions anybody might have.